Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. We know that colleagues are joining us today from many countries. Indeed, we think around 40 countries, and we're delighted about that, given the truly global nature of the topic for this conference session. I'm Professor Judith Smith from the University of Birmingham, and I'm also Deputy Chair of Health Services Research UK. I'm really delighted to welcome the many hundreds of colleagues who are joining this conference session today. And it's the first of 6 plenary sessions that we'll be holding today, tomorrow and on Friday. And I do hope you'll be able to join us for some or all of them, and also engage in the online discussion during and after the sessions, and indeed by contributing through Twitter using the hashtag HSR UK 2020. Now, over the past 2 weeks, we've been posting onto the HSR UK conference website recordings of the conference papers, the posters and workshops that have been accepted following a peer review process. They've already had thousands of views, and we'd really encourage you to take a look at those when you can. They're organised into themed sessions, and there's some really fascinating new research findings, challenging debate, and on a really wide range of timely and important topics. I want to take this opportunity to express our sincere thanks to the Health Foundation and to the Nuffield Trust, the research foundations in London, for their support of this conference and more generally for Health Services Research UK. Now, in terms of this conference, back in March, when it became evident that the coronavirus pandemic was taking hold across the world, the board of Health Services Research UK took the decision to move our annual conference from an in-person event in Manchester to a virtual one. Now, this felt really risky when we made that decision and a real step into the unknown. But in these extraordinary times, it felt and feels absolutely the right thing to do, as it feels more important than ever that the health services research community has opportunities to come together, to share research, to debate emerging questions and issues, and explore what we might do together to bring evidence-based insights and advice to the really major challenges that are facing all of our health systems, our communities and nations at this time. So it was on this basis as well that we decided to focus this opening plenary session of our conference on the topic Lessons for International Health Services Research from the COVID-19 Pandemic. And we're absolutely delighted to have 2 stellar plenary speakers to share their insights and stimulate our thinking today. And they are, we're going to be hearing from Professor Trish Greenhalgh, who's a GP and Professor of Primary Care Health Sciences at the University of Oxford. And she's been centrally involved in undertaking evidence reviews to inform the pandemic response. And then we'll also be hearing from Dr. Josep Figueras, who's a physician and he's director of the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies, and is based in Brussels. And he also acts as an advisor to the European Union, to the World Health Organization and the World Bank. In a moment, I'll be inviting Josep and Trish to give their conference presentation, and that's going to be followed by some short responses given by our excellent panel of researchers who are drawn from our HSR UK community, before we'll be then opening up to a wider discussion, responding to questions submitted by those of you attending the session. And in a moment, I'll tell you how you can submit those questions. Our panel members are going to be Dr. Chiara Dall'Ora, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Southampton, Mark Dayan, who's a Policy Analyst and Head of Public Affairs at the Nuffield Trust in London, Dr. Ashra Khanom, who's a Research Fellow at the University of Swansea, and Dr. Sidhu, who's a Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. Now, in terms of how to ask questions, you can do this while the speakers are giving their presentations, or indeed while the panelists are making their responses. You select the Q&A option from the webinar menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'm sure practically everybody's really used to using Zoom now. And you can also, as well as submitting a question, if you see a question that you really support or would like to have asked yourself, you can upvote that using the thumbs up icon in much the way you might do if you were liking something in Twitter or on Facebook. And this will help our moderators know which questions are seem to be the most pressing or popular ones, and hence which I should be putting to our speakers and panelists in the discussion that follows. And I say, just to remind you, please do debate on Twitter as we go along using hashtag HSR UK 2020. Now, in the recent weeks, the extraordinary and unprecedented challenges of the pandemic, I think, have really put research at the centre of government policies and decision making across the world, and also in discussions about national and international clinical practice and service organisation. And scientists and academics have been prominent in the media and public debate, some even becoming household names in different nations. So in this opening session, we're going to be asking, what should we learn from the way in which health services research has been used or not by governments, and also how evidence has been put to work to inform practice in areas such as social distancing, the wearing of masks, new ways of organising healthcare delivery, for example, perhaps remote consultations, and much more. So I'm now going to invite Josep Figueras to give his presentation first, and then that will be directly followed by Trish Greenhalgh. Now, Josep's going to be talking about knowledge brokering in the times of COVID-19, science, policy and politics, and Trish will then continue and she'll be talking about masks for the public, a case study in how evidence is valued. And now, just to remind you, after that, I'll be then introducing or inviting our panel members to each of them give a response before the more general discussion based on the questions that you submit to us. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome both Josep and Trish, and now hand over to Josep Figueras, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us today.
Thank you, Judith. Good morning to everybody, good afternoon and good evening, as you said. What a privilege to be able to address all of you today. Yes, what I wanted to do in the next few minutes is to talk about the interface between science, policy and politics. Some broad reflections, it's really a broad topic for 15 minutes, some broad reflections, but by bringing them together, I hope to give you an understanding, a different perspective on this area. Ultimately, what I like to do is to draw some broad lessons around the knowledge brokering. You're all knowledge brokers in these very complex times of COVID-19. I'm going to organize my remarks around three major areas, quite straightforward: the basic framework, the evidence, the policymakers, the recipients to some extent, although should be co-owners as well, and the knowledge brokers yourselves. Before doing that, I like to remind us, what would be a perfect knowledge brokering, inverted commas? In the Observatory, we use these four principles, the four T's: trust, timeliness, tailored, and translation. Trust drawing from credibility, from the credibility of the research, neutrality. Timeliness is perhaps of the four is the most important. The evidence has an impact when it's presented, when there is a window, a political window of opportunity. Tailored, this is the evidence has to be around the priorities, the questions, the worries of the policymakers. And translation, obviously, with synthesis, with clear relevance to the needs of policymakers. So how does that look in the times of the COVID storm? Well, we haven't done that well, really, both sides of the equation. We saw a lot of mistrust around issues of whether the quality of the research is credible, whether there's independence, not always tailored. The policymakers ask one question, we answer another one, which we believe is more important. And we see this phenomenon of lost in translation. Having said that, timeliness has played in our favor. Anything is published on the subject, is read, and policymakers are paying lots of attention. So something is on our favor at the moment. But let's start with the evidence. And how it's this quote from General Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian general. It's quite interesting, I think, because it summarizes a bit the complexity of obtaining data and evidence amidst the fog of the pandemic. We talked a lot about the war against COVID. And we can perhaps draw the first lesson here, even if it's a bit shallow. Maybe a lot of what I'm going to say today is shallow, but I hope slightly inspirational. He's talking about war and uncertainty, and he's talking about the fog, wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty, and the need, the first lesson, of discriminating judgment and a skilled intelligence to send the truth. But really, let's go back to basics, colleagues. How to make policy decisions with flawed data? Do you realize that we're not clear neither on the numerators or denominators? Population at risk, we're comparing countries which are very different in terms of their aging structures, their risk factors, coronary vascular diseases, or diabetes, for instance. And we are comparing the rates across countries. Cases, we don't have to discuss about that. There's a lot of debate about whether more tests, less tests, more cases. And deaths. Let me give you a snippet of something you know, but just a reminder about deaths. The most basic evaluation of the impact of our interventions is whether people die or not, right? No, we're not even clear about that. Let me remind you of that. This is a snapshot we did on your left, one of these policy snapshots looking at different ways, some examples in which member states sort of categorize COVID, seeing that some are following the WHO definition, where clinical diagnostic is clinically diagnostic based, confirmed or probable, and probable, while others are using only COVID deaths when there is a test-based required. These differences, I have here a few countries of all the ones we looked, explain what you have on your right, data from the economists. Let me highlight to you, colleagues, that some of the best data comes from the Financial Times, from the Economist, from the Guardian, which is quite interesting, actually. Some of the analysis and communication has been particularly good from these main media. So if you look at neighbor countries, let's take, for instance, the Netherlands and Belgium, it's not surprising that when you look at the percentage of excess deaths explained by COVID, in the Netherlands, using a test base, it explains 63%, while in Belgium, perhaps too many, explains 115%, which is another issue. But how do we make decisions with this level of evidence uncertainty? We see poor quality of some of the research, not blaming the researchers because of the complexity and particularly the speed. Yesterday with Professor Greenhalgh, we were in another webinar with very good webinars of the Health Forum Gastein, talking precisely about this balance between quality and speed. So can we have both? And how do we deal with this conundrum, the speed to provide data and the need to have good quality? I'm sure that's going to be an issue that's going to be raised in a minute. Here are some of the measure areas, starting with the retraction of the Lancet, the splitting hair debates about, well, is pre-symptomatic, are we contagious, pre-symptomatic, or is it asymptomatic? There's been a lot of debate and U-turns in this area, and indeed, the area that Judith has raised already, which is the distance, the public relations on distance and face masks. Here, much more learned colleague, Trish, will be talking about that in more detail. Just to say only in the right-hand side of your slide, the enormous difference in the public regulations on the using of masks between member states. And what happens with that, colleagues? Well, this leads to very divergent and often very contradictory advice. Is it surprising then that there's no political compliance? Politicians become very, very wary, and more worrying, of course, public compliance. So this also is a bit, this diversity at the root. Again, I'm a bit shallow, I apologize, but I think it's important to bring all these trends together, of this new science called infodemiology. So we need this new science to deal with this overburden of information in the world of uncertainty, which then leads to very poor quality and fake news. Dr. Tedros in a conference was saying, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. Fake news spreads faster and more easily than the virus and is just as dangerous. So as knowledge brokers, part of our work is not only produce good evidence, on time by being able to deal and help our policymakers with this overburden of data, some of it actually behind vested interests. But colleagues, isn't there evidence? Look at these health messages. If you put a bit of gloss, if you change a bit the style, wear a mask. Save yourself by following simple rules. Remember, coughing? Wash your hands. Or the headline below of a newspaper of the time in 1918. Influenza epidemic closes schools, churches, and theaters. Sounds rather familiar. Shouldn't we have perhaps applied this very basic precautionary principle in some of these measures rather than splitting hairs? Of course, you'll all say, and I will agree, the virus is not behaving, the COVID virus is not behaving in the same way as the influenza virus of the SARS virus. We know that, and that's been one of the key challenges. Having said that, some of these basic elements of masks and washing hands and so on, and even some physical distance could have done without measured lockdowns. Why it took us so long? Why we've been discussing so long about masks? Was it so expensive to do masks at home? Let me leave that because actually, I apologize, Trish, because you really, everything I know about that, I learned from you. So you'll talk about that in a minute. Second group, the policymakers. By seeing those faces, by seeing these smiles or less smiles, already sort of reminds us of the diversity in communication, the diversity between policymakers, the diversity in which they take into account evidence in their policies. But also, let's be a bit nice with policymakers. Not all of them have votes in mind. Well, most of them have votes in mind, but we need to remind ourselves that they also have a job. They have to respond to the socioeconomic, cultural, political, and cultural realities. Part of what happened in Sweden, their decisions, is not just evidence. It's about the Swedish exceptionalism. What happens in the Netherlands and their approach has to do with their love for autonomy and liberal values. I would argue, and I'm in Britain right now virtually, that some of what happens in Britain, some of the decisions, is the British aversion to the nanny state. So we need to be aware of that. I know you're aware, but do you remember that when you look at the evidence? Also, remind yourself, decision-making should be informed by evidence, not based on evidence. Policymakers have to understand the evidence, but it's their decision to take into account these elements. And finally, it's been very complex. In any emergency, and COVID even more, there's no more a difference between science, policy, and politics. It's practically the same thing. It's merged together. It's messed up together. That makes your job, our job, extremely difficult working with policymakers. But let me give you two very basic lessons, still not for basic and not important. When you're addressing policymakers, there are two fundamental issues, values, not values, elements. One I already mentioned. The other one is awareness of cognitive bias. You, when you present data and evidence, have your own biases which are there. Policymakers have many of those as well. This very good volume, I advise you to read, The Political Brain. It talks about the role of emotion, the role of emotion in policymakers of different political parties. And there are many biases in these emotions. Here I put two of them that are particularly important in times of COVID. One is confirmation. Any evidence that confirms your policy, the policy you want to put in place, well, you'll take it. So if you want to be effective, just go to those policymakers that want to do exactly what your evidence says, and you'll have high impact. Secondly, sunk costs. Once you invest in a particular policy, even if it's not working, you still hope after so much investment it will work, and you keep going. These elements, plus many other biases, have to be built together, brought together, and also built on tacit knowledge of the policymakers if you want to communicate effectively. So this is the first lesson, working with policymakers. The second, again, I said that one, but let me repeat it. Ultimately, political decisions have to consider value trade-offs. It's not only about technical advice. And the Economist, as always, sort of highlighted this element, saying about the stark choices between life, death, and economy. And this blogger talks about saving grandma or saving the economy. Of course, my values are saving grandma, but these are the values of my societies, are the values our policymakers will be reflecting, particularly as the new waves arrive. So we have to be very cautious understanding all these elements. Again, not rocket science what I'm saying, but sometimes we forget it. And now finally, you. the ones sitting in your homes following that, because knowledge brokers are scientists, are researchers, are knowledge brokers themselves, as civil servants informing policymakers or advising policymakers on evidence. So this is, I'm basing all that on our research on this area. The Observatory is looking at the European countries, how they've been doing knowledge brokering in these times. We've seen a range of individuals, advisory committees, task force or institutions as knowledge brokers. Many models, I would love to have the time to talk about those and how these models have to do less with their effectiveness, but their cultural makeup, their context play a key role. Range of expertise, but careful, perhaps if I may, too many epidemiologists and virologists. Please, the epidemiologists in the room should not be upset. I'm saying they should be there, but shouldn't we have as well other, in some instances, other even philosophers, behavioral scientists, and others in these groups? Two conclusions. We see that scarce experience on doing on the evidence to politics interface. So there is not much experience in doing that properly. It's an area which is underdeveloped. And however, they have played a key important role. Often these individuals in public communication, obviously, and huge impact on COVID. I have here at the bottom some t-shirts that shows that in some countries, these have even become almost pop stars in this field. Oops, yes. Sorry, it keeps jumping up and down. Yes, very quickly, because I'm running out of time. Let me give you some lessons on the effective attributes of knowledge brokering. No big surprise for you. Multidisciplinarity, scientists or knowledge brokers, well, wherever they are, skills training is key. Institutional framing and support of these individuals is fundamental. The transparency and the ability to communicate uncertainty is fundamental because it really leads to trust. Look at the chief epidemiologist in Sweden that has accepted errors, and that has continued with the trust of the Swedish population in spite of the errors. Objectivity and independence, and diplomatic skills, although it's not always about telling truth to power, is it? I mean, we need that diplomatic skills. However, there are many scientists that are saying now that is about ethics. It's also about a strong advocacy ethos. And we are not just scientists for knowledge brokering, we have our opinion as well. I leave it up to you, perhaps over the debate, to discuss that. Very briefly, before I conclude, let me show you this knowledge translation platform that the Observatory has put in place with the WHO and the European Commission. We have a range of partners in Europe. In the UK, we have the Department of Health and the Health Foundation, which has in itself actually an excellent tracker. What we did here is to look at countries, look at their responses according to the policy important areas, prevention, human resources, delivery, governance. We have the ability to compare these countries, but more importantly, I wanted to highlight in a split of a second, this cross-country analysis. We call them policy snapshots. Quick, not dirty, quick and short and sharp, relevant. We ask policymakers their questions, what they want to know from other countries, timely, response within 3-4 days, and multidisciplinary. Two examples in front of you, one on strengthening health systems resilience, the other one, my colleagues have even developed a kind of snakes and ladders board game to try to understand how a system of testing and tracing and isolating comes together. And if you don't look at the overall system together, which is very often among researchers, you look at testing, look at isolation, you look at public health, how you bring these elements together. This is the dimension you want to give to policymakers. So that's the work of my colleagues Raja and Silas and Maki. So let me therefore conclude within a bit of the time, Judith, apologies, being feeling free. As I reflected a lot, as I worked with policymakers across the region as a kind of a knowledge broker, I like to finish with some Stoic lessons from Stoicism, actually on the virtues of Stoicism, based on the thoughts and meditations of Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. Actually, he died of an Antoninian, what was called Antoninian plague, because he died of that. Apparently, was unclear what it was, actually as measles or something else. And there are three virtues there that I really like to take you take seriously, even if it sounds like a joke. First is humility and willing acceptance as knowledge brokers. Science is only one factor in politics. I know you know, I know we all know, but we forget. That doesn't mean, the Stoics will tell you that it's not about humility and allow people to hit you. The Stoics ask for objective and very rigorous judgment, being aware of your own subjective perceptions as well, being objective, being rigorous. So this for us means awareness of our own cognitive biases and values, and take this into account, how they influence us, how they influence our clients. Transparency, full transparency, understand the evidence limitations. And third, being objective and humble doesn't mean that we have not to be courageous. The Stoics talk about courage and action, but unselfish action. Again, pragmatic action, what can be done and cannot be done, and reminding ourselves in that unselfishness that ultimately we are accountable to policymakers, whether we like it or not, having voted through a democratic process. As they say, the democratic process is the best of all bad systems of governance, but it's still the best. Thank you very much for this opportunity, colleagues. And now I'd like to introduce Trish Greenhalgh, who no doubt will bring the real science behind that. Mine is a bit of a general talk about the whole thing. Thank you very much again. Trish.
Yes, thank you very much. And that segues straight into my talk, which is called Masks for the Public, a case study in how evidence is valued. Now, Josep talked about the role of emotions in decision-making, and I would say that the emotions we feel towards policies reflect our values. So let me just playing with how to move this on. Yeah, here we are. So I would say that the arguments about masks for the public in almost every country in the world, and you know, some places in Asia got it right from the beginning, but in most countries there's been quite a bit of arguing among policymakers and in the public and the press about whether we should be wearing face coverings in public places. Now, you can divide this a bit schematically into two competing narratives. On the one hand, the narrative that this should be policy because, say, the people who propose this, because the evidence base is strong, because it's common sense, and because of what we call the precautionary principle. In other words, even if the evidence isn't perfect, we have a moral imperative to act because the risks of not acting are very high and the harms are probably very low. The other narrative is that it should not be policy because the evidence base is actually quite weak, that harms could occur and those should not be ignored, and that good science requires good research. Therefore, the priority is to quickly do more research to get a stronger evidence base. So let me take you through the narrative that masks and face coverings should be policy. And there's been a number of papers, some of them written by me, published on this. Not all the papers have been written by me. The Royal Society in the UK, the Delve Initiative, produced a very lengthy paper, which was quite comprehensive. And I think this one on the bottom left is the Journal of the American Medical Association. So lots of different groups have been putting out this narrative. So what does it say? Well, the first argument in this narrative is laboratory evidence. And there's these rather wonderful pictures, images of what happens when you sneeze or cough or speak or shout or sing. And this has all become rather sophisticated with the visualization. So they're often quite colorful and I think quite dramatic. Surely, if this is the stuff that comes out of your mouth and nose, wouldn't you want to cover it up? And then these experiments also show that if you put a piece of cloth in front of your mouth, far fewer droplets light up. The second argument comes from modeling, and it says, well, look, we know that a cloth mask isn't perfect, but let's assume it's, I don't know, 80% effective or even 60% effective. And we also know that not everyone is going to wear a mask or a face covering, but let's assume that, say, 80% of people would do it, particularly if it was mandated. Now, you can see on this modeling diagram, these contour lines in the yellow and then moving through to the green and the blue reflect the R naught, or actually the effective R value. And what we want to do is bring it up into the blue. So this is again a very dramatic picture. It sort of implies that, well, if 60% of people wear a mask that's 60% effective, we're still going to bring the R value down low enough to prevent the transmission of this disease, and so it eventually die out. Now, that's been criticized, as you can imagine, because hang on a minute, what were the assumptions underpinning this? But this picture has really flown around the world as part of this pro-mask narrative. The third argument in this narrative is the stories which support the hypothesis of asymptomatic carriage and super spreader events, particularly the very famous study now of the choir practice in a Presbyterian church where something like 45 out of 60 people became positive for coronavirus, and at least two of them have died. And the commentary on that choir practice said, when do COVID-19 super spreader events happen? And the author answered his own question: wherever and whenever people are up in each other's faces, laughing, shouting, cheering, sobbing, singing, greeting and praying. Now, again, this is very narrativized. It's all about the stories, and some people are not terribly impressed with these stories, but on the other hand, these stories do demand an explanation. They demand an explanation, and they also fire off our imagination as to what could have caused such dramatic super spreading. The fourth argument, and this is a slightly old slide now, is the natural experiments, where we look at countries that have introduced face coverings very early in the pandemic in that country, and what happened to the bending of the curve. Now, this is extremely schematic, but as the evidence has accumulated, the countries who introduced masking very early are all in the right-hand blue group. The ones that introduced masks later are often, though not always, in the orange group. Let's go on to the alternative narrative that masks and face coverings should not be policy. I couldn't find a peer-reviewed paper on this. There's a lot of preprints around, but actually the peer-reviewed literature is a bit thin on these arguments. I think this will become, they will get published, but most of them haven't yet been published. So the first argument is that there's no strong evidence from randomized controlled trials. And I think it's important to remember that there has never been a randomized controlled trial of masks or face coverings worn by the lay public for source control during a respiratory pandemic. Now, there have been lots of randomized trials of masking, but they're all in closed systems. There have been trials of people wearing masks on aeroplanes. There have been trials of people wearing masks in high-risk work environments, such as meat factories. There's been some very interesting trials of masking on pilgrims to the Hajj, in university halls of residence, and also masking in people looking after children, for example. So the child is sick and the parent wears a mask, or indeed an adult who's sick wears a mask themselves to prevent their carer becoming infected. But those are all in closed systems and not in a community. So why don't people do randomized trials in the community? And the answer is, they're pretty impractical. You could consent me and randomize me to wearing or not wearing a mask. But if you're interested in whether somebody else gets infected, you've then got to measure the infection rate in people who didn't give consent and who weren't randomized. So it's a much more difficult thing than taking for example, an index case in a household, and then randomizing the household as the unit of analysis and spinning off from the individual to other people in that household. So that there are real practical problems. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So the absence of randomized controlled trials, the randomized controlled trials have not been done. That doesn't mean that they've been demonstrated that the masks don't work. Secondly, that the general public won't wear masks properly. And I collected these pictures from the internet. That's Cindy Lam from Hong Kong with her nose popping out, and then people touching their masks. And this rather alarming picture of a chap covering himself and his baby with some kind of plastic bag. These are widely available, and you can see it. You can walk into the supermarket and see this kind of behavior. Of course, unless we educate the public, unless we have a campaign to tell people how to put on and take off their mask, it's not going to work. However, I would say that I'm not sure it matters too much whether people touch their own mask, because after all, you're only touching your own germs. I think the whole idea of this medical grade donning and doffing has been rather overdone. There's no evidence that we really have to wear the mask perfectly. Perhaps a good enough masking would do. The third argument in the anti-mask narrative is do no harm. If everybody rushes to buy medical masks, we're going to exacerbate the personal protective equipment shortage that has been really tragic in many, many countries, that the doctors, nurses, the healthcare workers haven't been able to get masks. The throwing of the mask on the ground, and also another argument is that wearing this kind of mask will give you dermatitis, rashes, all sorts of problems. So it's actually going to damage the person wearing it. And of course, there is a counter argument to that, that actually homemade cloth masks, or indeed shop-bought cloth masks, are pretty good. I've given a response here to a journalist. She asked me, should people wear cloth masks or should they try to find surgical or medical ones? And I replied that they should wear cloth. Medical masks aren't designed for comfort. They're designed for very short-term use. They're scratchy. They can give you a rash. But also, just like you use a handkerchief and not a piece of cardboard to sneeze into, cotton cloth is actually a really good material to catch the droplets that are coming out of your mouth and nose. So I think one of the things that we need to do is shift away from this idea that wearing a face covering is a medical procedure. It's actually just basic decent hygiene. Again, a public information campaign on this is essential. Another argument in the anti-mask narrative is risk compensation. And you can see this picture on the bottom left of the little mouse here who's wearing a helmet. And so he's more likely to try and grab the cheese from the mousetrap, which is going to cause him harm. And the very powerful image here on the right, that this lady is wearing a mask and so she thinks she's Superwoman. There's no evidence whatsoever for this, and there is beginning to be some evidence that actually if you're wearing a face covering, you are more likely to wash your hands, you're more likely to maintain social distance, and people are more likely to maintain distance from you. So no evidence for that. Another argument, I think this is the final argument in the anti-mask narrative, that masks are a middle-class privilege. Apparently these ladies are famous supermodels. I don't know who they are, but they're wearing rather charming masks, and wouldn't you say they look rather coquettish? But of course, these masks are extremely expensive. They're made by people like Dall'Ora and stuff like that. So this is now being put out by some professors of public health, actually, that we really shouldn't do this because it's going to increase inequalities. Actually, the evidence shows a much more nuanced picture. that community mask making cooperatives are one way in which people can actually gain an income, and the whole sort of social solidarity of doing this kind of thing at a community level. There's some lovely examples, for example, from South Africa, where this has drawn communities together. And the feeling, for example, when you're getting on public transport, that everybody else has also covered their face. My mask protects you and yours protects me. That makes us all feel rather more comfortable going back out of lockdown in a pandemic. So I think, if anything, I would say that there's some evidence that masks can reduce inequalities. Next argument, and it should be argument 6, sorry, I've got my numbering wrong, the civil liberties, my body, my choice. Donald Trump has heavily politicized the mask issue in the United States, of course, but there are counter arguments to that, that rights, for example, come with responsibilities. And as a cancer survivor, I am very concerned about people who are vulnerable. I used to get the tube in London to go and get my chemotherapy many years ago now, and I was extremely vulnerable to infection then. So I think it's this whole argument about my right to go around without a mask, of course, it needs to be balanced by my responsibilities towards my fellow citizens. In these unprecedented times, there are strong arguments that mask wearing is a social duty. I wrote up some of these arguments in a paper which is available. You can put it into Google, face coverings for the lay public, laying straw men to rest, because I think a lot of these counter arguments are straw men. They're a sort of imaginary what ifs without actually evidence to support. So just to sum up, I think the two narratives are illustrative of competing value hierarchies. On the left, that masks should be policy. I think those arguments are more theory driven, and what the people like myself are saying is that rigor in science can embrace a very wide range of methodologies, a wide range of study designs, but we put them all together to build a complex picture of what's likely going on. I would also say that the stories that I've briefly alluded to, the cruise ships, the choir practices and so on, they can improve our scientific understanding and ignite our moral imagination. The counter narrative is much more methods driven. Rigor for those scientists and others who support this, rigor means randomized controlled trials or a much narrower range of evidence. And they're quite keen that anecdotes and speculation should be dismissed. So what about the choir practice, you know, that kind of thing, except for the anecdotes and speculation that they want to put across themselves. So I hope that was useful. I bet we have some questions, and I'd love to have a discussion when we open up for questions. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much to Josep and Trish for those fantastic contributions. I was particularly struck, Josep, from what you said about the point about decisions should be informed by evidence rather than necessarily based on evidence. And also I noted, you know, policy and politics become one in emergencies. That really resonated, certainly with me. I don't know whether it did with others. And then Trish, again, your strong point about competing narratives about mask wearing and the connection there with value hierarchies, I think some really powerful points there. And likewise, again, this question about what sort of evidence and what sort of evidence, I guess, ultimately do we, or indeed politicians and policymakers, value. So I'm going to now move on to introduce our 4 respondents drawn from our Health Services Research UK community. And I'm going to invite, first of all, Dr. Chiara Dall'Ora from the University of Southampton to make a response in a moment. Now, just to note that a couple of years ago at our conference, I think we were in Nottingham then probably, Chiara won the prize for the best abstract at our Health Services Research UK conference. So just to remind ourselves of that. And Chiara undertakes research particularly in the area of nursing workforce. So Chiara, tell us something about just a brief response to what you've heard from Trish and Josep.
Sure, thank you, Judith. So the presentations we have just to highlighted the diversity of responses to COVID-19 across countries, as well as the challenges that as health services researchers we face when trying to influence policy. When reflecting on why, in front of robust studies presented by trusted experts, some policymakers across the world have appeared to ignore such evidence, the policy framework by John Kingdom came to help. Kingdom posited that for any policy to be successfully implemented, there needs to be high public concern and high intersectoral support, both of which we have a weakness, especially in countries where governments, scientists, and the private sector have joined forces. However, there's a third aspect, and perhaps the missing link in several countries, which is that a favorable political climate must exist. A favorable political climate is one where not only doctors or healthcare professionals, as Trish reminded us, are guided by the Hippocratic oath primum non nocere, but also where politicians also strive to achieve the common good. So when focusing, for example, on how the health workforce has been organized and deployed across different countries, it appears that some policymakers have preferred fiscally deliverable solutions instead of prioritizing what was good for the health workforce and ultimately for all the people. For example, in the UK and Italy, the political and media discourse has been mainly centered on the heroification of the health workforce. Yet many staff reported that they were not provided with adequate personal protective equipment, and hundreds of health and social care workers lost their lives due to COVID-19 in just over 2 months. So solutions to support the workforce have been proposed worldwide, especially in Nordic countries and China. And these include, for example, offering staff flexible work schedules instead of having staff work long shifts of 12 hours or longer, ensuring that staff with children have access to 24-hour childcare on site, involving healthcare staff in decision-making, and providing financial support in the form of bonuses and temporary salary increases, particularly in Eastern EU countries. So to conclude, in recent years, there have been tremendous technological advances. We're now able to access a plethora of routinely collected data. And I think as health services researcher, we should use this data, workforce and patient data from the past 3 months, to uncover which practices worked and which did not, and find the right channels, or perhaps becoming knowledge brokers, as Josep was suggesting, to ensure that lessons we have learned from this pandemic can help us do better in any crisis which may arise in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. That's really interesting to pick up that point to get about data. I mean, Josep made that one, as you say, that this is a very data-rich time, isn't it, that we've got a lot, but also to really pick up those changes that have been happening and different responses in terms, in that case, in terms of workforce, the pandemic. I'm now going to invite Mark Dayan from the Nuffield Trust to give his response. Mark undertakes a range of policy analysis and research at Nuffield, but I think he's particularly known in the UK in recent times for his fantastic analysis of the potential consequences of Brexit, the exit from the European Union, certainly for the NHS and health and social care services in the UK. So Mark, over to you. What did you make of the 2 presentations we've heard?
I thought they were both really interesting, great presentations, and they, for me, raised a lot of issues about another part of my role at the Nuffield Trust, which is to be in charge of how we communicate our research findings to policymakers. And something we've started doing in the last couple of weeks is looking back at phase 1 of coronavirus, particularly in the UK, and thinking about what is it that happens sociologically that can make it very difficult for policymakers to take accurate evidence-based decisions in a timely way, like both Josep in his slide and Trish discussed. And I think it's worth going back to work like Ivor Crew's Blunders of Our Government, which looks at multiple times when essentially politicians in the civil service have got judgment calls wrong, and examining a couple of the sociological elements that he kind of lays out there and what they mean for using research. One very powerful one is what he calls intellectual prejudice, and what other people might call bureaucratic inertia. And this is the tendency of government policymakers, operational leaders, to simply stick on a course of action that they were already doing quite firmly until some really overwhelming force deflects it from them. And I think you've seen quite tragic examples of that in the UK with the lateness of many of the containment measures, and in countries like Sweden with their really firm adherence to a course of very limited containment measures despite increasing concerns about the outcomes of this. It's driven by bureaucratic incentives within the system, by an intellectual framework that will have built up around that and can make it very hard to change course. And I think the implication of that for researchers is not to be afraid to make your case very strongly and to be quite cautious about dynamics like the one Trish described, where you worry about first do no harm, and you want to be very balanced in your recommendations and to be realistic that in the absence of a strong contrary recommendation, what bureaucracies tend to do is not pursue a balanced approach that hedges its bets, but choose one solution and go for it really quite firmly until courses change. The other dynamic that I think tends to set in and is often associated with failures of decision-making is centralization in an extremely small team of people at the top of the hierarchy with limited awareness of crucial facts. And again, I think you've seen this incredibly clearly in several countries in coronavirus. There's a famous example in the UK where a major policy shift happened essentially because a single mother, member of the public, personally emailed Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's senior advisor, saying, "It's very difficult for me, I'm not allowed to see anybody." 2 days later, the UK government announced a policy of support bubbles for people living alone, essentially based on that single email of anecdotal evidence. And that, for me, it tends to be intensified during periods of crisis when trust is low, particularly when things are perceived not to be going well. And that, for me, gives you a very difficult message as a researcher, which is that you need to find some way to reach these incredibly time poor people who are probably aware that they don't have all the information they need. And doing so can require you to go to quite unconventional routes and to try and reduce your findings into really clear and bite-sized pieces. So those would be my reflections about the policymaker side of dynamics we've seen.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Very interesting, particularly that tendency of policymakers to have a plan and then sort of plow on with it. But I think also a really important point about the risk of a centralised approach, or even quite an isolated approach for the small group of people potentially making the decisions. I'm going to move on now and invite Dr. Ashra Khanom from the University of Swansea to give her response. Ashra is involved in some other Health Services Research UK sessions for our conference this year as well. I think there's one about the health experiences of asylum seekers and refugees, and another one about who makes high use of emergency ambulance services. So if you want to go and look online at our conference website, you can see some of the other work Ashra has been sharing during our conference. So Ashra, you're very welcome, and over to you for your responses to what you've heard from Trish and Josep this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. I'd like to say both presentations have illustrated how COVID-19 has thrown into sharp focus the intersectionality of research evidence, health policy, politics, and their overall impact on health outcomes. Whilst acknowledging that the 2020 pandemic is a medicalised emergency, there needs to be a clear focused public health response to stop the spread of this virus. Political context, as mentioned, the level of investment in public health will be critical on how a country can respond. So while novel technologies and randomized controlled trials may be useful in building the evidence base, what we can do, whether we are from a resource-rich country or a research-poor country, is to focus on presentations. and make use of good old-fashioned methods of manual contact tracing to build the evidence base. So local contact tracing is a vital source of data for monitoring and addressing the pandemic. It can provide information on where the virus transmission is taking place, what sort of contacts pose risk, who gets infected, and this information can be directly fed back to the community for a quick response. However, challenging resources away from hospitals into public health can prove to be an unpopular move, as it challenges traditional power base and the popularity of secondary care. As highlighted by Josep, 100 years ago, the Spanish flu pandemic, during the Spanish flu pandemic, people learned through trial and error that lives could be saved by staying indoors, social distancing, wearing masks and washing hands. These same public health messages are still relevant today. They need to be reinforced and disseminated to populations at the local level through local organizations, local leaders and community groups. Policymakers cannot expect people to judge risks around COVID-19 or use their common sense, as mentioned in the UK many times, as both are reliant on knowledge and on people's ability to understand scientific concepts, and also the ability to avoid risks such as overcrowded workplaces, access to income and food. Moreover, political leaders need to be guided by the science, and they too need to lead by example to instill hope. For example, Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, and President Moon Jae-in are some of the leaders who have all worn masks in public, while others have not been able to put aside their differences for the greater good and cannot bring themselves to wear a mask. So going forward, we need imagination. Failure of information, failure of policy is not good enough. The virus definitely is not short of hosts, as there are 7.5 billion of us on this planet. So that's my reflection. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Ashra. Thank you. No, that's excellent. Really powerful reminders. And I think that really powerful point as well about the in one sense, really good public health practice in terms of contact tracing, that of itself and the other measures related to that are really important, but also they're again a source of really important data for managing the pandemic and understanding it better as well. So thank you for that, effectively like call for really effective public health practice in what's happening at the moment. I'm then going to turn to our fourth panellist, a colleague from the University of Birmingham, Dr. Sidhu, who works in our National Institute of Health Research Rapid Evaluation Centre at the university, who also has another paper involved in this conference, one on hospitals managing general practice that you may want to take some time to look at. So Mani, would you like to share your reflections on what you've heard?
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'd like to say two brilliant presentations from Trish and Josep, and unsurprisingly, I'm going to make the case for a greater role of social scientists, particularly sociologists and others, during this pandemic. So I'm going to fight our cause a little bit more. My first point is the way in which different sources of evidence are valued and interpreted as a crisis unfolds is really important. So very early on, across Europe and other developed countries across the world, we saw that the COVID-19 response was based on the best evidence, the best science available. But what does that generally mean? We know it often means epidemiological data or RCTs and modeling. So much of the lockdown measures, wearing of masks, social distancing was based on very strong evidence. However, failure to recognize and consider other elements of data or theory-based evaluations or theory-based data can often lead to blind spots and misguided decision-making. For example, if you take the case of the impact of certain COVID-19 responses on socially disadvantaged communities across developed countries around the world, we know very little about the cultural attitudes towards wearing masks for people maybe from disadvantaged communities who are more likely to be on public transport, to be working in the meat factories, which are areas of high risk, and what their feelings are towards these COVID-19 measures. Theory-driven approaches can be incredibly valued early on during a pandemic or moments of crisis, because they give you the opportunity to understand the nuanced aspects of context, why people do what they do given the circumstances that they're in. And that's really important for to have a range of evidence and have a range of evidence bases when making decisions. The second point I'd like to make refers to Joseph's understanding of knowledge brokers and the role in and of leadership during knowledge brokering. So we understand that knowledge brokers play a valuable role in bridging knowledge with policy recommendations, but is it enough just to be part of the consultation process? What role can knowledge brokers have? And do knowledge brokers need to be beyond the kind of scientific evidence advisors that are more epidemiologists and virologists that Joseph mentions? And do we need more sociologists, psychologists, and economists to be part of that process? If they do need to be part of that process, how can we ensure that sociologists and others like them can be seen as credible sources of information and knowledge that can contribute to policy recommendations? So those are my points.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you for that reminder about the need for that breadth of expertise and input. I think a point that actually both Josep and Trish drew out as well, and I guess it's a counterpoint to Mark's point that the risk of going down a track as well and potentially getting stuck in the furrow as one makes one's way. Right, we're going to move now, and I'm just going to very quickly just ask Trish and Josep to just any brief reflection on what they've heard from the panel before we'll then start addressing some of the questions. Although we've got 36 questions, we won't be addressing all of them, but we'll have a go at certainly a few. Trish.
Yeah, just a very brief comment. I was struck from, I think, all the panelists whose comments I found very, very interesting and helpful. I was struck by the support for social science, and we're all keen on data, we're all keen on epidemiology, but I think one of the things that this pandemic has taught us is this is about people, it's about discourses, it's about the policy science axis interface, and data never did speak for themselves. That was, data don't fall from the sky, data facts are value laden, all those kind of things. And I think we're smack up against all those issues. And that's going to be outside some people's comfort zones. But I think it's something that we really do need to get our heads around as we gear up for, dare I say it, wave 2.
And I think the point about social science connects to what about nuance as well, doesn't it? I think so, in multiple perspectives. Josep, your reflections on what you
Yes,
heard.
adding on that, actually, when Mark was talking about the blunders of the policymakers, let's remind ourselves that some of the blunders of the policymakers, talking to a group of CMOs the other day, was because the first models where we're trying to filter uncertainty were pretty poor. And they were not, Manbinder, they were not sociologists there, they were not economists, they know behavioral scientists. So actually, many policymakers could have made many more blunders if had paid attention to these initial models. Second point, very quickly, Chiara and Mark, absolutely, all of you, beautiful points. Let me combine very quickly the need, we are looking at that as well, to strong governance at the central level for certain areas, purchasing equipment, regulation, some communication, but humility. Not only because the health workers have given their lives for this, but also because the amount of innovation, the amount of change we saw in weeks among these groups, the changes in the skill mix, the leadership is phenomenal. Some of us have been years studying that and talking about management and change and how complex it is. We are humble, realizing how much these professionals under pressure had made change. And third, very quickly, Ashra, absolutely. The blunder coming now is public health. We do not have in most countries the resources, the training, the capacity, and the understanding. We keep talking about that. I don't see, with some exceptions, that's happening. And now is the blunder to come. We're aware, we know it, we talk it, and we don't get there. Judith, yes, decision-making based or informed by. I wouldn't say that for clinical treatments, needless to say. I'm just acknowledging a reality that when values are important, we need to consider those. It's silly and naive to think that policymakers are going to read our papers and do exactly what we tell them. And thanks God they don't do sometimes, because precisely as Manbinder said, we are very ourselves in silos when we provide that research to policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you to those reflections. Now, from the questions we've got, the kind of highest scoring or most popular one at the moment is, how can we make sure we review and learn from what we've done so far to inform the next stage of planning? So how can we, yes, learn from where we've got to so far to inform the next stage? Who'd like to have a first go at that one? Trish, is that your finger? Yeah, Trish, go for it.
Yeah, I think this is complex stuff. There aren't any simple solutions. There are never simple solutions when we're talking about rapidly unfolding complex phenomena. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is create space for deliberation, create space for people to collectively make sense of what happened, and also to tolerate and contemplate multiple, perhaps competing interpretations of what went on. So I'm very keen on keeping that kind of messiness. I think the public space is a very good place for that. I don't like suppression of data. I do like open arguments, and I think we need to do a lot of that. We're just actually working with the Nuffield Trust on a project that we've had funded from UKRI to organise some online workshops with stakeholders to deliberate along with patients and the lay public and policymakers and scientists, etc., around certain aspects of COVID-19. I think more of that needs to happen. You know, we're all really good on Zoom now, aren't we? Let's use it.
Great. And any thoughts from others of you about this one, about how we can learn? Ashra.
I'd just like to say, picking up on what Josep and Chiara said about the innovation within the health service, and that's been possible because the clinicians know what they're doing. They've asked for funding, they've asked for staff, they've got it. But I am aware now that a lot of this is being pulled back and that innovation is going to be lost. So going forward, we need to see how we can capture that and keep it going. And I know we say say, for example, within the NIHR, we have a lot of managers, but some of these managers are clinicians. So we need to know how we can work through their management process and give the frontline staff a bit more autonomy.
Really important point. Josep, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, very, very, very much echo what Ashra said. And we're seeing that across the countries. There's a real fear that all these developments on telemedicine, all these developments and allowing them space, flexibility, environment of budgets disappear. And echoing, of course, what Trish, with such wise approach, has said, is all about, for you health services researchers, abandon for a bit your focus, your narrowness. It's part of science. But now, look, I'm going to be much more basic and Trish, look at the wood rather than the trees, be able to see the forest, see how these elements come together. Is systems complexity what requires right now? No more and more narrow studies about bits of the response to COVID.
Thank you, Josep. The next question I'm just going to take is, it builds on what we've just been discussing there, I think. There's a question, is there something different about policy making during a pandemic, or do these lessons apply to all healthcare policy making decisions? So is there something different about this time now? Who'd like to have a Mark?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And my initial response, based largely on the UK, would be it's similar, but much quicker. And that's the difference. And to some extent, I think there's been a value in the fact that the very fast timescale of the thing lets us see some of the weaknesses which are usually there. And so to choose one which has been quite prevalent, certainly in the UK, there are also some bad examples in France, tendency of governments to set unrealistic targets and as a way essentially of deflecting policy focused on an issue and then fail to deliver on them, for example, on testing protective equipment. Now that happens a lot, and we've been complaining about it for a long time. But during a pandemic, when the moment at which it becomes apparent that the target won't be met isn't 3 years later, weeks later, suddenly that's much more visible questions about, you know, is this a sustainable and productive way to set and communicate priorities for a health system?
Thank you. Chiara. You're muted, Chiara.
Sorry. Yes, no, I just wanted to echo what Mark was saying and just reflect on how, you know, it's quite known that whenever policy is generated in a time of crisis, of course, the response is going to be much more rapid and kind of sometimes a bit more based on gut feelings and rather than strong evidence. But I would also say that maybe the political climate that was there even before the pandemic contributed then to the response to the pandemic itself, so that it's not just how they reacted in the very moment the pandemic arose, but also everything that was there before contributed.
Absolutely, as we so often know in, I think certainly in social science research, context sometimes feels like it's everything, doesn't it? But it's certainly a very big part of what we do and how we work. It's going to move us on to another question we've had. Should we be rethinking how science advice is given to politicians and governments, and then obviously how that advice is used, and any sense as well as to countries that have either been particularly have got that right or not? I don't know, Josep, do you want to have a first go at that, given your sort of?
Yes, I'm always reluctant. This is the question that I dislike the most, and because of the no, I'm saying because of the question I hear more often in my job. I think we have to be very nuanced, and actually, Chiara said it beautifully just a second ago. They depart from very different perspectives, from different cultures of decision making. They depart from different ways of communicating. So I was saying earlier. So yes, I mean, Germany has been the darling of many of the countries. Some of the Nordics, the Danes, have done particularly well. The Finns, less known, and done particularly well. So, but we need to judge that according to their context, to their situation, of how fast the pandemic developed there. But there's one element I wanted to link this to the prior one, which is extremely important. The situation is not because the hydraulic brokering for the pandemic is not just the pandemic, it's any big event, any emergency event. So as Macmillan said, you know, events, dear boy, events. In big events, as we said earlier, Judith, policy and politics and science come together, and that's impossible. The beautiful news here for many of us is that populism can get away in other circumstances. With the virus, it cannot, because the virus will ask for accountability. That's perhaps a good news on this merge when populism tries to play with this merge.
Do you want to add anything about that one, Trish? About the...
I would say that we have to be careful about assuming that there is a single, almost like a technical right way of science to link with policy. I think, as Josep said, that these things are relentlessly contextual, and what works in one country isn't going to work in another country, but that there are some high-level principles, for example, the commitment to deliberation and sharing. But I think also, I would say one of the things that I've seen in my own research at the Science Policy Interface is the willingness to accept that one's perspective as a scientist is different from someone's perspective as a policymaker, and vice versa. And I think once we can go beyond a hierarchical relationship, once we as researchers can say, actually those policymakers are pretty good at their job often, it's not what we do, but it's a different set of skills, and to start to learn what it is that the policymakers need to do their job better, rather than say, look, these are my ivory tower findings, I wish those policymakers would take more notice of them. So I think those kind of mutual respect, attitudinal things are actually, you know, really, really important. And I would say that the countries that have done well are ones that have got that relationship. And if you look at the countries that haven't done well, you say the United States, the disrespect is palpable. That's enough for me on politics.
Manny, a point from you.
Oh, yeah, I just want to make a quick point that knowledge brokering happens in a very state of flux and change. It's never a static process, and what we know now 3 months on from when the pandemic came to Europe, as such, is vastly more than what we knew then. And what we need to do is make sure that there's an element of reflexivity, or kind of making sure that we reflect back on what the knowledge brokering process is, what's happened, and how we can move forward whilst the pandemic is still evolving and changing in the next weeks and months. And I think that's quite vital to make sure that we really have this process embedded within knowledge brokering to kind of get the most out of it.
Thank you. Now, as ever with these sort of events, time is sort of starting to be against us, so I will be wrapping up in a few moments' time. Now, we've got a huge number of questions, but just to reassure colleagues that what we'll be doing is we're going to ask certainly some of our contributors, I think, to potentially write a blog or make a contribution based on some of the key themes that have come out, and we'll be able to continue discussion certainly on Twitter, and I think we can also do that on the HSR UK website. But just before I draw things to a close, I'm just going to ask each of the contributors just in one sentence to say, what's the take-home message from the discussions we've had today about this whole issue of health services research and what it brings to the current pandemic situation? Now, you're all going to have to do it, but I don't mind who goes first. So Trish got her hand up first.
Just, I think, plurality of approaches. I think we've heard from almost everybody a wide range of different research designs, rigor differently defined in different kinds of studies. But I think this is one for pluralism in approach, is my take-home message.
Thank you.
Shall I?
Ashra, yeah, go for it.
I'd just like to say, in my view, countries and states who have been successful at keeping COVID-19 deaths low have been transparent and open with their population, and have had a robust public health sector in place, which was able to be mobilized early on in the pandemic. And I think, again, they go back to the public sector. We need to sort of filter that scientific knowledge down to the ground level, where all the actual action, I would say, is going to take place in the future now going forward.
Thank you. Manny?
I think for me, what the two presentations and our discussions really led to is the opportunities that are there for a wide range of stakeholders across science and policymakers to really get involved, to really grasp and understand what's happening as part of policymakers, governance, how decision making is happening, all the way through to the communities that are kind of bearing the brunt of those decisions as well, and what that impact has really been. So it's almost saying everybody's invited, and we all need to kind of, as Joseph said, broaden our focus and not to be too narrow anymore. So the opportunities are there, and we should make the most of them.
Great, thank you. Who's next?
I can go.
Chiara?
Yes, so just very briefly, I think, at least for me, that's something I would really like to know more about and expand on, is the idea of becoming a knowledge broker. I think we should all consider that. I mean, we all are, as Josep argued, but I think we should all become more aware of this and learn how to make the most out of it, and then, yeah, be able to pass on the messages to policymakers and join forces, I would say. I think we heard a lot on this plurality, and I think we all have different interests and different voices, and we should really all join first and work on this together.
Fantastic. Mark?
So I think my take-home lesson will be something that really ran through both Trish and Josep's presentation, and it's kind of another dimension of that broadening that Manny spoke about, and that's taking international evidence really seriously. And one of my reflections on the first wave of coronavirus would be that if lots of countries in the Western Europe, not just the UK, but others like Spain and Italy as well, had taken had taken more notice at a more serious level of some of what happened in East Asian countries like South Korea, really we could have saved tens of thousands of lives. And I fear that sometimes there was a kind of not invented on this continent attitude to that, which we need to really think seriously about supplying the knowledge to prevent that from happening again.
Thank you. That's a really powerful point, Mark. And Josep,
Mark, Sorry. Yes, I mean, I could repeat, and I would love to repeat what's been said before, because that was absolutely perfect. And Mark, not only the Europeans repeat the mistakes, but the United States and the Americas repeat the mistakes. So it's almost a very discouraging process. Well, I'd like to finish by repeating what everyone said, but perhaps going back to my love to Stoics and of these messages of action, humility, and rigor. We want the policymakers to be rigorous, to be clear of their perceptions of their cognitive biases. Let's apply that to ourselves. We're full of cognitive biases ourselves as researchers. That's something that Trish has been teaching me over the years, the need to examine and to see your own values when you pretend to be a knowledge broker. And perhaps plagiarizing Ashra, imagination. Very good point. I like to finish with more imagination, more creativity in this field. The virus has brought all of us to our knees. We really screwed it. We got it wrong. So let's be more imaginative and more creative how we deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for that. And I think those messages about humility, imagination, inclusion are just really, really important ones for us all to take away into our ongoing work. I just want to thank all of you, to Trish and Josep for fantastic plenary presentations, to Mani, Ashra, Mark and Chiara for really stunning responses and contributions to the discussion. And thank you to all the people who've attended this session this morning. There's well over 600 of you. Thank you for your questions. I know we've only answered a small number of them, but I say we'll try and pick them up in other by other means afterwards, online and through blogs and so forth. Now, there are other plenaries happening. There's another one later today, certainly today in terms of UK time. It'll be at 1400 hours British summer time. I know that's a bit late for colleagues who are joining from Australia and New Zealand, but they're all being recorded, so can be watched through the Health Services Research UK website later on. And so the one later today is on this topic of, does evidence matter to managers? Making the case for evidence-based management. So thank you to everybody who's taken part today in whatever way and from wherever you are in the world. It's been a fantastic and thought-provoking session. And so for now, thank you and goodbye.